Hey friends, welcome back to another video. If you're new here, my name's Hannah. We talk about books, chronic illness, and life in Amsterdam. Thanks for joining. We are here to talk about everything I read in September, which honestly was a bit of a crappy reading month. I did read 9 books, but honestly, mostly quite mid, just a couple of winners, some comfort reads, and nothing else to write home about. So hopefully this is going to kind of be short and sweet. Because I've definitely felt out of the habit of reading in September. I wasn't really drawn to books, and I don't know, just wasn't really working for me. Hopefully with the microphone you can't hear, but there is construction work going on around our neighborhood constantly, and especially today, so apologies if you can hear that. So I'm going to start with my comfort reads because I don't have much to say about them because they are rereads. I listened to the first and the second in the Nevermore series. So that is Nevermore, The Trials of Morrigan Crow, and Wondersmith, The Calling of Morrigan Crow. I like to listen to these on audio when I'm trying to sleep at night, in the middle of the night, or just when I'm resting. They are middle grade fantasy, I guess, books, but they're kind of my replacement for Harry Potter. I was a diehard Harry Potter audiobook fan through my childhood, early adulthood as well, always listened to them as a comfort. And then, as we know, the author spews so much hatred and vitriol that, not to say, I know there's people out there who still decide to enjoy the books for what they are and feel like they can separate it. I don't feel like I can do that. And I also feel like even when I just don't get joy from listening to the audiobooks anymore because of those feelings that are so gross. So I am always on the hunt for books that have that almost nostalgic, cozy, fantasy, witchy elements to them, and the Nevermore series really does that for me. I've got a couple of friends onto them, and I've also bought them for children in my life. So they follow Morrigan Crow. She is a cursed child, and on her 11th birthday she is taken from her home where she is pretty unloved and unappreciated into another world where she joins this, what they call the Wondrous Society, essentially like a school for gifted children with all different types of skills. Like her best friend is a dragon rider, someone else a mesmerist, and it has a really funny found family cast of characters, with elements that are a little spooky, but nothing too scary. So I really enjoy these books on audio. They're really well narrated, with really good sound effects, and I'm eagerly awaiting the 4th book, which has been delayed a couple of times. I believe the author I think has long COVID, if I remember reading that rightly, but hopefully it's coming out next spring. So that's books 1 and 2 for September, were the Nevermore books. I also listened to on audio You're Embarrassing Yourself, Stories of Love, Lust and Movies by Desiree Akhavan. Desiree Akhavan was part of the directorial team of The Miseducation of Cameron Post, which I didn't know that until starting reading this book. But I really enjoyed her takes on what it's like to be a young queer woman in the film industry, a young American Indian woman in the film industry, and how she negotiates expectations and attitudes towards her heritage, towards her queerness. They're short essays, some more interesting than others, I would say. I didn't have my attention held totally throughout, but I really liked her authorial voice. I thought she was pretty funny at times, pretty witty. And there's some pretty typical, embarrassing school age type anecdotes, which I feel like, it was fun to read. It's just not that memorable to me. But I love the cover of this so much. And then I also listened to The Manicurist's Daughter by Susan Louis. This was a memoir following Susan's life after her mother passes away from a botched plastic surgery. Her mother dies in the US from medical malpractice, and when Susan's 10 or 11, and she's got 3 other siblings, and her dad and they sort of have to muddle through their grief and their experiences. Prior to her death, her mum ran like a couple of nail salons very successfully. They are a family of Vietnamese immigrants living in California. She talks a lot about the migrant experience, tracing back her family heritage after her mum passed away, a lot about like family custom and tradition in terms of like speaking to past ones and understanding where your loved ones are after they die, traveling back to Vietnam at points. This is a really moving and beautiful story of grief, and it has a really interesting metatextual level as we see Susan perform or produce and perform a play while writing this book, understanding the experiences of her mum and beauty standards and the Vietnamese immigrant experience. And she uses this play as a way to almost talk to her family members who aren't prepared to talk about what it was like to lose, their shared matriarch. It is a really complicated book in places, though, because it does, or left me with complicated feelings at least, because it does deal with this topic of beauty standards, which also feeds quite readily into fat phobia, because her mother passed away from like a tummy tuck and is always very conscious and part of diet culture and self-conscious about her body and passes that on to her kids. And Susan tries to rally against that, but in places I think doesn't fully think out those ideas of body neutrality and still comes across in places as fat phobic and talks about relationships with fat phobic family members and aunties. And yeah, I think in places it's handled well, in other places it's a little clumsy. So that would be my only caveat to reading this book. But I did really enjoy it, and the context is, super specific, but really, really well executed. I think that's all the audio I did. Then I read Blue Sisters by Coco Mellors, which you would have seen me talk about over on Instagram. I had a little moment for a little rant because this is Coco Mellors' second book. It follows the Blue Sisters, one of whom passes away from drug overdose, kind of wrapped up in this prescription medication addiction related to chronic pain from endometriosis. And if you guys watch the channel, I live with chronic pain, and one of the illnesses I have is endometriosis. So I was very intrigued to see how Mellors would handle that writing in this book. And unfortunately, she falls through so many common misconceptions and misinformation around the disease that I've found it utterly frustrating to read, and just really sort of disappointed and resentful that a book like this is being read by so many people and it's spreading such misinformation about endometriosis having a cure related to hysterectomies and how that's not true. And I think a lot of it was so clumsy around that conversation of Nikki and her wanting to be a mother and how nothing would help her endometriosis until she had a baby. And I think narratively that was also tied up in the novel that I found it hard to separate it. Saying that, I did really enjoy the other sisters' perspectives, particularly Bonnie, the boxer. I saw Mellors in an interview said she spent 1.5 years with a boxing trainer to try and understand Bonnie as a character. And what was even more infuriating to me is that she couldn't spend just a few days with people with endometriosis to try and understand their perspective before writing a character with so much misinformation. So yeah, this was a real dud for me, and yeah, just annoying that when we get books about chronic illness, they often are written by people who don't have experience of the disease and don't even have the foresight or respect to look into them properly. So that was a real bummer. I also read Exalted by Anna Dawn, even. I heard a lot of people talking about, I think she has a new book out. This is a very strange, definitely like lost women doing messed up stuff kind of novel. It's all tied to this idea of an Instagram famous astrologer, or an Instagram famous astrology account, I should say, like astrology memes. And we followed the dual timeline of two different women, one who runs the account and one who is in her 40s and struggling to make ends meet, and has just left a really toxic relationship, toxic on her part. And she is kind of struggling to find sense of herself and how she became the person she was that was so hurtful to another. This was really strange, and it gets weirder and weirder and weirder as this book goes on. It felt a little try hard in places, and the reveal of the after the one night stand, which if you've read this you'll know, I found like utterly unbelievable, which isn't a problem because I don't think much of this book is believable. But I think it was just a little bit of a cheap shot, maybe. So this was a really strange book. And I think up until like the 60% mark, I had quite a good time reading it. But as it got more and more absurd, it lost me a little bit. I think it became a little rushed and a little bit, the plot points became like more and more nonsensical, and that kind of lost the rhythm of the story for me a bit, I think. So yeah, a mixed bag with Exalted, but I did have a good time for the most part. Okay, then I think I just have to show you 3 physical books, which I have in front of me, which luckily those are actually the winners of this month. And I think I mentioned in a vlog that I felt like a lot of the books I read this month, I felt like I was in a bit of a rut with reading, and part of it was from e-reading. Like I felt like the pages were so grey and I wasn't really engaging in the writing. I was just reading the words. So I ended up switching to physical books for the last part of the month, and I found that really helpful. I did, however, read earlier in the month, My Friends by Hisham Matter. This is a book that was up for the Booker long list. I don't think it made the shortlist, but this is Tom's copy. He read it earlier in this year, and it follows two friends and a third friend in part who meet at university. They are Libyan students studying in Edinburgh. They come down to London to go to a protest at the Libyan embassy following a murder of some journalists, I believe, is what they're protesting. Essentially, it was like during the Gaddafi reign where, numerous human rights were being attacked on multiple fronts in the country. And it tells this story of these two friends trying to place themselves in the world, in the UK, while things at home are becoming more and more dangerous. They worry for their families, they are in contact with them less and less, and they're trying to work out what it means to be a migrant and what it means to support the resistance while keeping yourself safe. And each of them sort of choose different paths to how they can help, through writing, through returning home from joining the military, through contacting various people in power and trying to push out Gaddafi. So it has this, and it's all based in like real recent history. So it has that real interesting news type element to it. But it also has this beautiful story of male friendship, of division and reunion through the 20 years that they've been friends. And we have this dual timeline of our main character, Mustafa, following him reflecting back on when him and, I forget the other person's name, Khalid, I think. Khalid, when they first meet, and then them as older men. And I really liked that. And I love gentle and caring male friendship in books. I think it's really hard to find done well. And particularly in this political context, I did really enjoy it. It took me a while to get into it, I will say that. But I think after we reached the first crescendo of the event at the protests and the young men being injured and that fallout from that, I think then I became really invested really quite quickly. So yeah, I liked that. I also read Dolores by Laura and Amy Curtis. This is a really short novel. I feel like I'm speaking about these over and over again because I can't remember what video I put them in, or if it's just that I put them in my Patreon content as well. But this follows a young 16-year-old teenager who ran away from home from a series of incidences. Oh, that's my bookmark. Let me not forget that. That happen in her town. She goes to visit a cousin in Spain and then runs away from there and ends up at the gates of a convent. And we watch her slip into life with the nuns, and they name her Dolores. We know very little about her, but we experience these flashbacks and these small vignettes of her life back at home in her hometown, her experiences particularly with men and the violence and assault that she was unfortunately witness to. And it's very lyrical, and like these short snappy sentences, these kind of dreamlike phases that she goes through while she's doing things like cleaning the floors or making food. And it's like I say, a really short book, and I really enjoyed it. It has some really vivid pictures in it, so a strange one, but I liked it a lot. That's Dolores. And then finally, the last book I read this month was There Are More Things by Yara Rodriguez Fowler. This was probably my favourite book I read in the month of September, and it was pretty long and the font's really small. I bought this in a bookshop two times ago. I was in the UK, and I ended up reading it when I was just in the UK for a wedding. I think I featured this in my most recent vlog, and I really, really enjoyed this. I was really drawn in by the characters and the different perspectives we have from these two young Brazilian women living in London, similar to my friends who are experiencing life away from home and divorced from their family setup, but trying to stay connected to Brazil in different ways, and particularly to the political resistance. We have Catarina, whose family come from a long line of political resistors who are well known to the left, particularly her aunts and her father. And then we have Melissa, who her and her mum immigrated when she was young and has always been sort of out on her own in London, and Melissa knows very little about her Brazilian heritage, and these two women end up being housemates in London. And we watch as they forge this quite uncertain in places relationship and friendship as they come together through a period of unrest in Brazil. It plays with form in places and has a really interesting staccato to some of the chapters that I liked, and I was so invested, particularly in Laura, who and her story as a political resistor, and how she built this strong sense of hope among the grassroots community she was a part of in Brazil, and how that left a legacy on Catarina's life. And I really liked that whole history of Catarina's family. I really liked. I would say I'm not that au fait with Brazilian politics, which is like definitely a me problem. So if you know nothing at all, I feel like perhaps you would struggle, but there's nothing a few Wikipedia pages can't help you with. And I would really recommend There Are More Things if you want a really satisfying, longer, and like a book you can really get your teeth stuck into. It would be this. So like I say, a real mixed bag in September, but a couple of standout reads. Let me know what was the best book you read, and if you're planning on picking up any of these, I would love to hear from you in the comments. I love chatting to you guys. I shall see you all in the next one. Bye.